Hey everyone, my name is Rick Gualtieri, and this is another Tales of the Midlist author. NaNoWriMo is over, and hopefully you had some really good success with that. If not, no worries. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But if so, just a reminder that December is Edit Your Work month. I know some people out there definitely put out very clean first drafts, but the majority do not. I know I'm one of those. If I were to release my first drafts, I'd probably be, it wouldn't be pretty. Anyway, what I wanted to talk today was about writing in a shared world and writing in an owned world. With competition so high out there these days, I think with like 6 or 7 million books in the Kindle store and more being added every day, marketing is at a premium. Visibility, all this stuff. These are all like becoming major concerns for people who want to continue, who have survived like the early days of the Kindle Gold Rush, and now want to actually continue to be there as this becomes like more of a career, and the kind of bubble bursts, and we're all there. We're all left scrambling to find an audience. And as a result, one of the things some authors are doing is they're kind of joining forces with each other. And there's typically kind of two ways of doing this. One is writing in a shared world, and one is writing in somebody else's established world or series. Now, both of them kind of have some similar pluses and minuses. I think probably the most jarring, or I think the most important between all of them is, in all cases, you really need a rock solid contract to take into account these things. But each of them kind of has their own benefits and downsides. So I wanted to talk about both of those, and for anybody who's thinking about maybe kind of doing something like that. The first is a shared world. In this case, each author who participates typically has some IP ownership in a particular shared world. There's various ways you can go about it. In some cases, there's a shared pen name where everybody releases under, the same name, with each book. In other cases, there's branding that says, "Hey, this is part of so and so, and I'm releasing under my name." That's all details in the contract to be worked out and stuff. But considerations there are how you want, and how you want to do that is, yes, IP ownership. That's important. Is it a fully shared world, or does one person have more than one share? Are there provisions for bringing in other people into this shared world? You want to hash this out in the contract. Revenue and payment. Are you going to release it and everybody shares the revenue for each book, or are you going to do, I guess, kind of the easier way where, hey, when I write a book in the world, I release it under my KDP account. I get the revenue, and when you release it under yours, you get the revenue, but we all share in the marketing duties to make the entire series that much stronger. Is there an out clause? What if I contribute to this and I decide, no, I don't want to be a part of this anymore? You want to have an out clause in your contract to make sure that I can't just say, okay, well, I don't want to do this, so nobody can do this anymore. Whether it's a way to buy me out, or some way to to ensure that that something keeps going on just because one person maybe wants out or wants to be bought out. You want to take that into account. People leaving, people coming back in. What happens if the shared world is sold? A publisher comes over and says, "Hey, I want to buy this." You need to have that into consideration. Covers and editing are another big thing. Who pays for the cover and editing? Do you have one person who you all go to for that cover and editing for for branding purposes? These all things need to be established, as well as, is the series going to be wide, or is it going to be Kindle Unlimited only? The thing with the shared world is typically it works best if everybody pulls their weight. And in a lot of cases, I've seen shared worlds where it's usually established authors coming in there and writing. So therefore, it's not one person, not like in a lot of box sets where one person is a big name and everybody else is kind of hoping to kind of, I won't say ride those coattails, but in some ways it kind of ends up doing that. But usually there's kind of a pulling weight factor of it. And you also need to take into account with regards to like not only the world but the characters. Do you own sole rights to your character to a character you created in that shared world in your book, or is everything kind of considered jointly owned? Where that if you create you know like Rygar the like Viking in your book, can I use it in mine? Can I have him appear in mine? If I'm writing in that shared world. So these are all things to take into account. Contract is very important. You kind of like live or die with the contract there. But after the contract is done, it really comes down to who is doing what in the world, how often you're releasing, because the point of a shared world with multiple authors is to have those more frequent releases to hopefully keep building up and using that shared marketing muscle amongst that group to be a success. And again, whether you're doing it under one pen name or whether you're doing it under multiple pen names, there's a benefit to each. If you're doing it under each author releases under their own name, well, the benefit there is individually, that's a release for you as that author. It helps build your back catalog and all of that stuff. Downside is that, in some cases, somebody might be like, well, I'm a fan of this author, but I'm not a fan of that author, so I'm only going to buy the books that I know are written by the ones I like. In which case, the shared pen name, you're basically saying, okay, this we're all writing as one cohesive unit when it comes out, because we want you focused on the story, not the individual necessarily. So those are considerations to take into account. I like the concept of shared worlds myself. I guess you could consider Shingles in some ways as kind of a shared world, from the Authors and Dragons universe, and it's a lot of fun. In which case, we are doing that kind of simply. When I release one, I release it. When somebody else releases one, they release it. So the payment structure in that case is very simple. But with other regards, when you get into the legalese, you do want to have that kind of that solid contract in place to make sure that that in case anything goes wrong, you are covered, or in case anything goes super right, you're covered. Those are all very, very important aspects of a shared world. But I do like them. I think they're kind of they have potential to be fun, as well as you have that combined marketing muscle of multiple people, as well as output to keep that machine going. So it kind of takes the burden off it. So instead of hiring multiple ghostwriters, you all are essentially kind of a ghostwriter in some cases. Contrast that with an owned world. If you're familiar, a while back, Amazon had a program called Kindle Worlds, which I thought was kind of cool, although I think some of their payment options were a little onerous. But the idea there was various owned properties there. For example, I think G.I. Joe was one of them, where you could go and you could write stories within certain parameters in the G.I. Joe world, release them as a book, and you would get a percentage of those sales, and hey, be able to tell people, hey, I wrote a G.I. Joe story. It's now defunct. I'm not really sure why that happened, but unfortunately, Kindle Worlds is no more. But a lot of authors have moved away from that to kind of doing it their own way with their own contracts. And typically, the reason for writing it in somebody else's world is it's an established market, an established series, an established fan base, and there's usually a solid marketing core. This is a great thing, I think, for now if you're a journeyman writer or like a mid-lister, I think it's great to go in there and if you can hop on a super popular series, that can be a way to to boost your backlist. Or for a newer writer, this could be a way to get exposure because you're writing in an established series. Now this is not I think an official term, but I've heard it out there on forums that typically in an owned world, you divide it into two people, the alpha and the beta. The alpha, that is the person who is the IP owner. So for example, my series, The Tome of Bill, I have a book coming out, I believe we're running out of 2018. So I'd say 2019, that R.E. Carr is writing in my Tome of Bill world. So in this case, I would be the alpha, the primary IP holder, and she would be considered the beta, somebody writing in that world. Now those kind of make it sound like, I don't really like those terms because it makes it sound like, like it almost sounds like a BDSM thing, but in essence that is kind of like, the case. So the question there is, I would say going into it, because if you're the alpha, it's pretty much, I think, a win-win for you, because you have somebody expanding on your IP, expanding in your world, putting it out there. As long as quality controls are in place, hopefully you can put out something that's of similar quality to what you put out, or hey, possibly superior, which is also cool. So it's kind of like, I think a win-win for the alpha, unless somebody really screws it up. It's the beta that I think you need to take into consideration. And if you're watching this series, chances are you're probably more on that beta level where you're looking to say, okay, well, there's an opportunity to write in somebody else's world. What should I look for? Well, there's a couple concerns there. I would say is, how many other betas are there? I think in the beginning of a shared world concept, the people who get in, like, who get in early as those betas, those have, like, they have the best shot of, like, one, making a name for themselves, and two, probably making profit there, because they're early, they're expanding things, they're building off of, like, an established marketing base, and that's great. The question there is, and that's what I'm saying, is how many betas is in a owned world where there's too many releases. You're kind of probably, you run that risk of, like, of being that everyone who, like, writes in that world potentially makes less, except for the alpha, because once again, it's good to be alpha. So in that case, there's probably, like, pretty good impetus to be like, yeah, hey, okay, I have 3 people, hell, I'll have 4 or 5, a dozen, as long as they're writing in my stuff and I get a share of it. Hey, that's good. But for the betas, in that case, you probably want to keep in mind is, like, how potentially saturated is this? Are books coming out once a month, once a quarter, a couple times a year, more than once a month? How rapid fire are those? And, like, and check out, and if that's the case, if it is pretty rapid fire, talk to other authors in there, check out their ranks, see how well those are doing, because if it's rapid fire and everybody's releasing it and it's going up to the top 1,000, it's staying there for a couple of weeks, you're probably making some pretty decent money. In which case, hey, it might be worth getting into that. But if you see a bunch of new releases and they're popping out, and they maybe have a day or two in the spotlight, and then they drop down to like 100,000 or more in rank, it probably tells you maybe the market is getting saturated, or maybe people aren't that interested in authors outside of the main or so. In which case, it might just be not worth the effort. Because that's the thing with writing in a shared world, is that in essence, it's kind of it's not like ghostwriting, but it kind of can be like ghostwriting. So instead of necessarily being paid, like, a set fee, at least in a lot of these cases that I've seen, I think it's possible some people could do a set fee. And whereas with ghostwriting is usually anonymous, you're typically signing up for a percentage of the sale, and your name, usually below the originating author's name, so that you get credit as well. So it's kind of different from ghostwriting, but in the same sense, it could also be similar, because you're kind of going through the same thing in that you're writing something typically within, like, within guidelines, depending on how, like, how heavy-handed or not those guidelines are, can go back and forth, but there's typically rules involved that you're writing. And the other thing is, you're writing something that ultimately there's potential for joint ownership, but for the most part, you're writing something that somebody else owns. So how many beta, like, let's talk about some of those considerations. How many other betas are there? How often is there a release? What is the support structure? That's important. Is there somebody there to answer your questions? Like, what are you signing up for in the contract? Are you writing everything, handing it over, they're editing and just releasing it? Or is there, like, that support structure of, okay, we're kind of joint writing it. I can ask you questions. Maybe I'm doing the bulk of the work, but I can go to you at any time. I hand it off to you. You go through it a couple times. You hand it back to me. You want to spell these things out in that contract, so you know exactly what you're getting into. What is the payment structure? That's another thing. With a shared world, I think it might be a little simpler, but in an owned world, there's typically going to be a split. I know I hear a lot 50-50 bandied about where, the IP owner who may or may not do less work than you, but it's their world you're running in. So of course there's there's that concept of, they deserve a slice of that pie. I've heard that 50-50 number bandied about, but that's not a universal. I'm kind of looking at that with mine to say, okay, what's kind of like a fair split, depending on also that like concept of who's doing what work. But there's also things to take into account. I mentioned IP before. They own that world, but there's the question of who owns the unique characters that you're creating. At the very least, I would say chances are you're looking at a joint copyright ownership there. And the upside being that, hey, if they really like your stuff, maybe they can use it in other parts of their series. But the downside being that with that shared aspect, if you want to do something with those characters later, you really have to have their permission. Audio and print. How is that? What's the setup in there? You want to have that like taken into contract or into account with the contract. Again, Kindle Unlimited or wide. Another thing, and similar to shared worlds, but it's sometimes a little different with an owned world, is cover and editing. In a lot of cases with an owned world, sometimes cover and editing is covered by like the originating author. Other cases it's not. But typically they do want to have that branding in place, a look and feel. They want to have it edited similarly. But there's a question of who pays, but also who has the final say. Because you want to hash those out in a contract. I'm not saying either way is bad. Personally, I like it to be kind of a joint decision, but ultimately somebody does have to have the final say of yes, no, we're not going to do this on the cover. And even if you like it, that's great, or don't like it, that's great. I have the final say. You want to have to hash those things out in your contract. I like owned worlds a little bit less than shared worlds, and that's only just because just my personal thing. Like I like the idea of I don't have an issue with going in there and occasionally writing a story in an owned world. I see no issue with that. Hey, if Kindle Worlds had ever had Transformers, I would have been all up in that shit. Let me tell you. But they unfortunately never got that. But I think it can be fun to write in another world, especially if you're a fan of that world. Being a fan of a world, also having that marketing muscle behind you, there can be a lot of benefits. The downsides, though, are I think a lot of it comes down to what you hope to get out of it. Personally, I want to be known for my own IP. As I said, I have no problem occasionally writing in somebody else's world, but I have no interest in making it a full-time gig because ultimately I'm writing for their stuff, which kind of gives me almost like no backlist, for myself if I ever want to change things up. That's just that's a personal decision. I'm not saying it's a good or bad thing. I'm saying you need to decide from a personal standpoint what you're doing. And I've heard good and bad things about owned worlds. I've heard horror stories where people are like, I did all this work and I got nothing out of it. And I've heard other people who have who have gotten a huge boost to their own backlist by writing in somebody else's world, and it's been a mutual awesome thing. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. In either case, you need to have a pretty comprehensive contract that answers all those questions I brought up, and probably more. There's probably a few I'm skipping over, so that you're protected, the other people are protected. You know when you're getting paid, how you're getting paid, and you know what to expect at every step of the process. Because you don't want to reach a point where there's a disagreement and there's nothing written about how to handle that disagreement, because that can just lead to some really serious crap down the line. But also, make sure that you're comfortable with whatever you're signing, so that in case you do reach that impasse, there's no question, and there's none of that. I didn't know what I was getting into. Always know what you're getting into. I understand this is probably rambling a little because it is a complicated subject, but I think there's good and bad to both. As I said, I personally think shared worlds are pretty awesome. Owned worlds, I don't have a problem with. I just like them a little less, just from as a personal conceit. Unless I'm the owner of the world. But it does make things more complicated with regards to stuff, especially payments sometimes. I know there are some services out there like Bundle Rabbit that will allow you to do multiple payment options, because so far Kindle and a lot of the other platforms, it's one author who gets paid, and they don't do split payments, which is a real pain in the ass. There's a concept of going through publishers, all that. But regardless, you want all of that spelled out in advance so there are no questions. Um, with regards to money and marketing, you don't want to learn you don't want to deal with that stuff after the fact. Um, Cover yourself, know what you're getting into, know what you expect out of it, and feel free to ask as many questions as possible going into it. And you know, hopefully it works out for you, whatever your choice. Um, it's just one more arsenal in this wide world of publishing and marketing that you can use. But it's also one that you probably should choose wisely before you get into it. All right, I've probably beaten that one to death, bounced all over the place with it. As I said, it is kind of complicated, but just wanted to give an idea of some of the pitfalls and stuff to consider, or benefits to consider before you jump into it. My name is Rick Gualtieri. This is Tales of a Midlist Author, and I will hopefully talk to you again really soon.